of us probably have read Aristotle and know how closed it is still, and how many, real problems there are. But I think that you see, I think the experience, that I have talked about today could be gotten in a 6-week segment. If you met 2 or 3 times a week. But I don't think it could be done any shorter. And if you can't do it any shorter, you see, the politics I'm willing to cut up a little bit. I've taught the politics, but the politics, of course, is not as impressive a book, particularly for our kids. But I'm willing to take book 1 and parts of book 2, and then book 3 on the regime, and book 7 and 8, something like that. And that I used to do, although I'm never sure how successful it was in getting them to read it. But I could describe the political phenomenon. But this is a book that I just have never been able to. And you see, so I wouldn't answer your question. I don't want to answer it because I do have one point of advocacy here. I really think that you ought to spend more time on the books you're doing. I think that's absolutely the essence. I don't see that is, I suppose you could discuss some of the virtues, individual virtues, and that's valuable, but it's in a way the whole context of life and relationship to a whole set of traditions and alternatives that it becomes interesting. And it's only in such a focus I think it'd be worthwhile doing, and I think you must feel that yourself.
There's a tremendous tension in the course itself, which partly perhaps accounts for its success, between 2 valid things that most of us want to do, and we're not convinced that they can be done in tandem, but we're trying. One is the really deep confrontation with at least some parts, at least some text, and at least some great books, and the other is this broad historical perspective.
I think you get both my way, to be perfectly frank with you. I don't think the broad historical perspective is that important. I think that if a person knows one book well, innocence doesn't make any difference. He's going to pick up the other things later, to be perfectly frank. I think it's much easier to get that broad, superficial thing, you can tell them all the names if you want to. That'll make them happy. Yeah, it is that on the basis of the experience of one, which leads into the others, then you suddenly know what the issues are. Yeah, and the other, you're completely what?
That works especially well with certain key terms, and they've changed throughout history. Reason means what virtue means. Aristotle, you have to in order to keep the great book. Give them some sort of
but you see, if you took this, what I suggested, say, if you made it a course into ethics, you could take 5 or 6 books, and then everybody else is somehow derivative from those things, and then you can mention the other names, how they fit in schematically, in relationship to this. And I think that you do that. But the other way, the way you do it, I don't think you get this. I just don't think you can. I'm persuaded of it. And I'm persuaded of the necessity, the most important thing. And you see, I don't think they read, and I don't think they know how to read, even in the very simplest sense. So, in a way, I'd like to say that we can't have an argument because, I win simply because of this necessity from the very beginning. And then after that, once you've done this, then you can argue about the broader sweep and so on. But my experience is that the students want to narrow more and more, and that's the way they really learn. And if that they will, once they know how to read books and are really, passionately concerned, they'll pick up the rest. The general knowledge is very secondary. That's a very academic thing. The interesting thing is life and the effect on life and so on.
There may be actually a bit of philosophical disagreement involved in the 2 perspectives too. I don't think
I'm sure there is.
Historicist in a Hegelian sense, but the evolution of consciousness seems to be a really interesting story to sell to the students as a means of approach to some of those great.
But I would argue that the evolution of consciousness, one only becomes aware of that evolution of consciousness if one gets a very strong perspective outside of one's own consciousness.
Yes.
And I think that only comes again by this way. And I'm not sure that our evolution of consciousness is not a decline, and so on. You see, and that's how I leave those questions open in this way. You see. Does anybody want to talk about either what I was saying about the text? Does it seem a plausible general orientation? I realize how general it was, so it wasn't very satisfying. Or about the course, because I'll be leaving you, and I really do. I now feel a certain involvement in your common enterprise.
If you were teaching, let's say, Aristotle and Kant ethics, whether in one course context or another, to what extent would you make comparisons beyond the obvious virtues of reward versus virtue for happiness?
I would do it a good deal. I frequently do it. I frequently mention it. I'm constantly, just as I refer to their experience, and so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. They have to be aware of the difficulties. Aristotle's constantly raising them, too. I would do it constantly. but on the basis of what I'm feeling at a particular moment, or on the basis of particularly what they are, trying to see what they think about things. See, the big thing is to make them take it seriously, and the only way you can do that is beating them over the head, saying, this guy's saying what you're saying, and you don't like what he's saying. Yeah, that's one thing. Or the other is to say this guy is saying what you're not saying, and it's better than you. But the better one is to make them say, you see, they all hate Hobbes, and I say, well, you're all Hobbians, you live that way, and that's all you care about, and that kind of thing. But then also the kind of internal thing. See, once they built a little structure, if you have the Locke and you have the Hobbes and so on, I'm not suggesting you have to go terribly deep. I think you can do 10 or 11 books in a year. But that's it. I don't think any more.
Similar question about textual comparisons. Which type of these two comparisons, to your mind, comes off better? Comparison between, let's say, Book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics on Happiness and Aquinas' Treatise on Happiness in the Summa, which follows the same general line, but with a subtle but important difference,
Yeah.
or the contrast between Aristotle's Ethics and Kant's, which are very obviously contrasting. In other words,
I think I would do both. I don't know which I feel more comfortable because it's very interesting. I think both are very interesting. I'm not saying that one is more interesting than the other because, it depends partly on their immediate concerns. If they're Christians, and and serious Christians, then I think that the former is more interesting because it leads into the question that we were talking about this morning, which is, that's the reason why perhaps Pascal in there also would be extremely interesting. You see, as I say, there are very many ways of organizing this.
Did you have any feedback on the psychological process that goes through a student's mind when he compares two texts that are apparently similar and begins to see differences, or the process that goes through a student's mind when he compares two texts that are apparently very different and then begins to see similarities?
Yeah, I think they're both equally satisfying experience, but it's a very good question, and I don't. You see, I think the big thing, the most exciting psychological process, is for them to see themselves in a strange light, and to see new possibilities. And you can say that the great thing, the beginning point, less the religious question, although that may be different in Boston College, is the egalitarian issue. So that's what they really are, and that's the one thing they care about. It's the one principle. And it's the one thing they're absolutely sure is right. And that's, of course, Aristotle's Ethics is very helpful in that.
How much do you go into that question of the status of morality in the ethics of Aristotle? Is that what you try to get across to them?
Well, that's a very dicey question because you don't want to make them immoral. At the same time, you see, since they're already so immoral, if you moralize with them, it's better to raise questions about morality. They're already so immoral, although they may have a patina of moralism,